The following content is provided under a Creative Commons license. Your support will help MIT OpenCourseware continue to offer high-quality educational resources for free. To make a donation or to view additional materials from hundreds of MIT courses, visit MIT OpenCourseware at ocw.mit.edu.
So today we talk about ridership forecasting. Last time we talked about cost modeling. So we were looking at models to just estimate costs of service changes. Today we look at how ridership responds, which is the other big question that agencies, public transportation agencies have when a network will suffer changes. So we'll talk about ridership prediction needs and issues, alternative approaches to ridership prediction and forecasting. We'll look at some examples from several agencies, notably the Toronto Transit Commission and TriMet. We'll look at more advanced sort of GIS-based models, simultaneous equations models, and show some examples of software packages that people use for this. So one note before we proceed is that all of this lecture focuses on short-run, route-level prediction methods. We're not talking about regional level effects of, say, the land use influence on ridership or on total demand. We're talking about specifically transit ridership, and it's a little more short run. So you'll see how that plays a role as we move forward. Okay, so what are the roles? Why do we need ridership models? Of course, predicting ridership is tied to predicting revenue, right? So when there is any change, an agency is interested in will they lose ridership or gain ridership, and what impact will that have on their fare revenue, right? So first role is predicting ridership revenue as a result of fare changes. This is the most typical example. All agencies go through periodic fare changes unless they are completely free. So usually you want system-wide prediction, and the approaches are fare elasticity calculation. So you might estimate some elasticity, so response, average response of ridership to fare changes. You could use a time series econometric model as a better approach if you want to control for external factors. And the best methods use a two-stage market segment model, recognizing that different segments of the population might have different elasticities, different responses to a fare change. The second role is predicting ridership and revenue for general agency planning and budgeting purposes, so not necessarily fare changes. Here, again, we need a system-wide prediction, and the key elements are trend projection, and this is another place where a time series econometric model plays a role, right? Here, we're not necessarily looking at a response to something, not anything that the agency has control over, for example, but you might have the impact of gas prices or other external factors, population growth, things like that. So trends, seasonality, things like that. Then there's predicting ridership revenue as a result of service changes. This is the other very typical example. So here we are interested in more detailed route level prediction as opposed to system-wide prediction. And therefore, we need to take into account a higher resolution set of variables, like the periods of operation, the headway or frequency of service, route configuration, stop spacing, and service type, right? So because the demand responds to all of these factors. And which factors affect transit ridership? We mentioned a few of them. Broadly speaking, we can divide them into two categories: exogenous factors that are not under the control of the agency, and endogenous factors, which the agency has some degree of control over. So exogenous factors include auto ownership and availability and operating costs. The cheaper it is to own and maintain and operate your own private automobile, the less likely you are to take transit. Fuel prices and availability, same thing. Demographics, age, gender, so let's say income, all these things affect ridership and revenues. And then the activity system, so attractors, job centers, population density, things like that, also are affecting ridership. So to the degree that there's an exogenous change in the system, population, employment distributions, these things can influence ridership, demand for public transportation. So usually these things are assumed to be fixed in the short run, and we said that we would focus on short run predictions. So often these things are not considered in models. Some of them do, we'll look at some exceptions. And then there's endogenous factors, right? And these are the ones that an agency can control. So fare, the headway, which relates to how much people have to wait for service, route structure, which relates to the walking time, access and egress times, and the ride time. And then there's crowding and reliability. So obviously if we change frequency, we might change crowding, and also reliability through cycle time and available recovery time, as we've seen in previous lectures. So crowding is interesting because as crowding increases, that makes transit less comfortable, right? So that has an impact to, say, decrease demand. And then if demand is to decrease, then that would really reduce crowding. So there is some sort of loop there, a causal loop, which reaches some equilibrium at least when we look at snapshots. Crowding and reliability are difficult to measure, especially reliability is difficult to measure without AVL, and crowding is difficult to measure without APC, right? So usually these things are not accounted for in ridership prediction models. If you look at practice, these things are often excluded. They are important though, so they do affect demand. Reliability is a big impact, has a big impact on demand, according to revealed preference studies. Okay, so
Can I
yeah,
make a comment?
question, yeah.
In the exogenous factors, auto availability, now in this world where we're living, where we have TNCs, does that fall under auto availability?
Yeah,
even though it's not ownership?
that is an exogenous factor, right?
Yeah.
However you want to classify it. So the question is, transportation network companies like Uber and Lyft and Fasten, etc. All of these companies provide not necessarily auto ownership, but they do affect. They provide a different mode of transportation that competes in some cases, and in other cases might complement public transportation, right? So that's an exogenous factor. It's not necessarily under the control of the public transportation agency, and therefore it's not. I haven't seen any demand model that captures it. Although there is some research here at MIT that is trying to look at that, because that's an emerging trend, and it's important to see if we can capture those effects.
In certain places, it's decimating public transportation.
We don't know, right? We're still investigating.
But you said we consider those factors to be fixed, but actually TNC is an example of something which is rather dynamic in terms of pricing.
Yes, so I didn't say that we want to consider them to be fixed. I'm saying that if we look at what happens in practice, what the models that agencies have implemented and used to study or to predict ridership and revenue, those models, or if you were to do a survey of the industry, and even some models in academia, tend to assume these things to be fixed. And part of that has to do with the fact that the predictions of interest are short-run predictions. As for example, I'm going to raise fares by 25 cents. So should I include the effect of TNCs? Yes or no? Maybe. I don't know, but it could be a factor, right? So, good questions. Okay, so the traditional approach is reactive. So if there is an exogenous change, the reaction is to monitor that change and maybe respond to it in the service planning process. An endogenous change, such as a fare increase, it means that we're sort of modifying the system, and if we see a ridership change, we might then react to the ridership change. So it's always sort of catching up to what we see. So no attempt to anticipate impacts prior to the changes. Current practice, typically little attention is paid to the problem in many public transportation agencies, unless it's fare increases or major capital projects, right? So we just set an example of TNCs being a different thing. We haven't really seen serious attention until very recently of what impact that would have on ridership. Typical or traditional planning models are ineffective. Generally, they're not detailed enough to apply them for short-run predictions. So we're thinking here about four-step modeling. It's expensive to run. It takes time. So for short-run predictions, they tend not to have the high spatiotemporal resolution that you need to decide something about a specific bus route, for example. So these are typically not applied to specific case studies. Yes, question?
What is TNC?
Transportation network company. So Uber, Lyft, yeah, Via, Fastnet, yeah, all these providers. So ad hoc judgmental methods dominate, right? So now these methods are not the most accurate, obviously, but they are useful, especially if there's a small change and you have many proposals on the table, you have people experienced with the area or the network. They might have a good sense of how, at least the direction and the overall level of change that one might expect. But they tend to be quite inaccurate for disaggregate predictions, long-term predictions, or very large changes in the network. So if you're doing something small, maybe okay. If you're doing something significant, not so much. Okay, so we have 4 approaches here to modeling ridership, ordered from in order of increasing sophistication, starting with professional judgment, then non-committal survey techniques, then cross-sectional data models, then time series data models. And let's talk a little bit about each one. Professional judgment. So this is when you bring in, as an agency, either experts within the agency or consultants whose job is to predict ridership. They have a lot of experience doing so. They might have local knowledge, and of course the problem is that there haven't been any scientific studies that indicate the accuracy of these methods. They tend not to be reproducible. Every time you call someone in, that's a sort of a one-shot deal, right? So you're not really able to replicate those results easily or understand what led to the prediction. This reflects lack of faith in formal models in some cases, lack of data or technical expertise to support the development of formal models, or lack of time or budget to do so. And maybe most importantly, relative unimportance of the topic of ridership prediction in general. Too many agencies compared to the impact of changes or impacts on existing ridership. So agencies tend to worry more about the reaction of the public that currently rides their service than the general increase or decrease in ridership. Although they are concerned about that, they worry more about the former. So, any questions on professional judgment? We all know what this is, right? Okay. Survey-based methods, the next level of sophistication. So, here we go out and ask people, would you ride this bus route if it were extended to Kendall Square, right? Or if we provide a new train line, would you do this instead of driving your own car? Things like this. And how much would you pay? So you could survey people and ask them, would you take this or not? These are you lay out a proposal and you ask people for their reaction. This is called non-committal because people are saying that they would do it or not do it, but they are not committed to doing so. There's no promise that they will do so. So the stated preference might be quite different from the revealed preference if one were to actually follow up with what these people actually did. Question?
Is there a sense of accuracy? What is the difference of that?
It varies widely, and there are many papers and lots of studies that have looked at this. So
comment quickly, just to give us a sense.
So yeah, right here. So typically we have a survey, right? You might ask, say, 500 people or 300 people whether they would do this or not. A typical example is a roadside survey where you stop cars and you ask them, would you have taken a park and ride using the metro system or an express bus line? And they would say yes or no, and off you go. So non-committal, right? There's no there's no necessity to actually do that if you said yes. So the problem is that there's this non-committal bias. People tend to say yes more than they would actually do so. This has to do with sort of psychological factors. Sometimes the desire, somewhat subconscious, to be friendly. There is a perception that the person doing the survey is interested in a positive result, and therefore, as human beings, we try to be friendly or try to be positive, right? This is psychological, it's subconscious, it affects results. So what ends up happening is that there's an adjustment factor for the non-committal bias, and this is where professional judgment comes in. So you do have some survey technique, but at the end you need this fudge factor. You multiply by anywhere between 5% and 50%. And what that specific number is depends on the specifics of the problem, who you surveyed, how many people you surveyed, the experience of the person conducting the study. Any questions on non-committal surveys?
Yeah, maybe it could also be that I would say yes because I personally wouldn't use it, but I have a kid who might use it, and so
Right.
I know someone who would use it. So I say, I use it,
So
and I might even be
so the
blatantly
comments-
lying
right.
about myself. But I say, oh well,
Yeah.
if they provide the service, then my kid will use it. And
Yeah.
So I want to say yes.
I'll repeat the comment for the benefit of people listening on the web later on. So the comment is that another reason for non-committal bias is that you might know people who would write it. Or another instance of this is, maybe you ask, would you today have done this? And maybe today you wouldn't have, but you think typically I would, right? So then you want to be helpful and give what is most typical. Problem with that is that if everybody's doing that, you have a bias, right? Because you are doing, hopefully, a random sample. So you could have surveyed my spouse or my kid, but you didn't. You picked someone at random. If everyone you pick is trying to answer for someone else, or answer for what I would have done on a different day, and that all leads to a positive bias, then in aggregate you could have a problem. So it doesn't help if people are dishonest and trying to be helpful, right? Any questions?
Yeah, is there any way to randomize the direction of the question and somehow ask
Yes,
people?
but that's the next method.
Okay.
So we'll talk about that right now. So this is not recommended because this bias can be significant and it's hard to quantify. Now, there's something called state of preference analysis or conjoint analysis, and this is where we apply statistical techniques to try to correct for that bias. So this originated in mathematical psychology, and what we do is that it's a rigorous, detailed design of the experiment. And usually what you do is that instead of asking people if they would take this or not, you say, would you rather take this option or this option? And you present bundles, and you ask them to trade them off multiple times. You say, well, what if it costs $1 more? What if, and you have multiple levels. So people start contradicting themselves sometimes in these trade-offs, and you can detect the biases using those contradictions. Or at least you can rank the relative importance of different factors to that person, and then apply those factors to correct for the bias. So this area is evolving. It is being applied already by high-end consulting firms and also by researchers. So if you find research papers on demand modeling, state of preference surveys, you'll find these kinds of techniques being applied. This is very useful for new services or new service areas. Why is that? Why would this technique be especially useful for that? Yeah, Emily.
Because there's an existing status quo that they're sort of implicitly comparing everything
Exactly.
against.
If there isn't any service to start with, and you're talking about a new line or a new area of service where transit isn't really present, or not present to the degree that you're proposing, then there's no good way of looking at the existing demand and extrapolating from there. So then if you have to ask people, and this is a method to correct for the non-committal bias. One more comment. The MTA used this in the 1980s, and they concluded that they would raise fares to repay bonds that they had taken for capital projects. So it's been applied successfully. The next method or family of methods is cross-sectional models. So here we develop a model of demand as a function of route and demographic data to explain ridership. So we're looking at a snapshot at a single point in time, or say we pick a period of 3 months altogether, and we look at the ridership over those 3 months across different bus routes in the region, right? And then we observe that different bus routes have different demand, and they have different frequencies, and they run through sectors with different population densities and different employment densities. And we try to relate the differences in demand on those routes, the ridership, to those characteristics. This is called a cross-sectional model. So again, we explain the differences in demand as a function of the differences in characteristics. And there are different approaches here. Rules of thumb is the simplest. So we might say, you know, if it's a key bus route, then it has this much demand. That's a very sort of simple, crude example. The similar routes method is I'm going to convert this bus route to, I'm going to add frequency to it, say, increase its frequency. And then it's going to look a lot more like this other bus route that I have in another part of the network. So ridership should look a lot more like that. Maybe I separate my bus routes in the network into high ridership key bus routes that have certain high frequency and other less frequent bus routes that run on less dense parts of the network, and I take those averages and I apply them to extrapolate, right? So that's a similar routes method. You find similar routes, you use those to make a prediction. Then there's the multiple factor trip rate model. You, again, you do a regression maybe. You can do this with regression or by separate factors. So those are the last two bullets here. So you essentially run a regression where you have, maybe you load up a GIS layer and you have population density, employment density, frequency. And out of the regression comes these factors where you can control for multiple factors at the same time. Any questions on cross-sectional methods? Abhishek.
Because these models like generally focus only on endogenous factors and not exogenous.
Yeah.
So they don't implicitly capture the demand or how the demand is perturbed with reference to other factors. So how can this be generalized? So the second point there says that similar routes, like it can be generalized. A model that uses less data or is shallow in its nature would not generally be generalized, right?
Correct. Yes,
So
these models are hard to generalize because they don't. Because actually, any cross-sectional model is hard to generalize, right? Because you are looking at a specific time window of analysis, so you are already, in doing so, excluding any longer-term trends that are often exogenous, like fuel prices and population changes and things like that. So yes, by doing a model, even the most sophisticated of these, which is a regression, multivariate regression model, if you have any factors that you leave out, that can lead to biases in the estimators, right? So will you actually see that bias? Well, that depends on how short run of a prediction are you trying to do. Is your prediction going to be applied to a period in the short term that is very similar to the period you have now, where these exogenous factors that have been left out have not changed, and therefore there is no impact on the bias of this model? Or are you going to apply this, abuse this, let's say, misapply it, abuse it to predict outside of that window, outside of that domain where you do have changes that you did not include in the model, and they have affected ridership? Yes. So, any other questions about cross-sectional methods? Okay, let's move on. A little bit about regression. So this is an example of how an agency might respond to increases in demand by increasing frequency, and vice versa, right? So you look at, you start with an observation that ridership is quite high and the frequency is some amount right now, and then you react to that, right? So as an agency, you might say, well, this bus route is quite crowded, therefore let's increase the frequency, right? And let's increase the frequency. That's gonna have an effect on the demand curve, right? So all of these lines D are demand curves, and this demand curve shows the response of ridership to a change in frequency, assuming everything else stays the same, right? But there are also other changes that are not included here. So you might increase frequency, but there might be other exogenous factors. Exogenous in this case because frequency is the only variable being shown here. Any other variable that increases demand will not result in a change along the demand curve. It will actually shift the demand curve, right? So you have demand curves going in a third dimension, increasing demand in a third dimension due to other factors. So typically, again, agencies are reactive. They sort of observe an increase, then they move to the next one, and they're always thinking about one demand curve, if at all. And so it's better for this reason to look at multiple factors at the same time instead of just one factor, right? Such as frequency. Okay, so these are some typical transit elasticities. We have elasticities to fare, to headway, and to total travel time here. And so these are the typical values. If you look at many studies and take averages, this is what you find. So elasticity to fare, negative 0.3. Let's do a quick recap. What is elasticity? Henry.
Percent change in demand over percent change in price.
Yes, that's so the answer is percent change in demand or percent change in price. I want to make 2 adjustments to the definition. That's often how it's calculated, but it's actually the derivative, right? The derivative of the curve, not necessarily the percent change. That is an approximation of the derivative. And the other is that it's not just to price. In this case, we're looking at change to fare, or to headway, or to other disutilities, right? So any other factor that affects this utility. So what is the difference between what does negative elasticity mean?
When one
As all those variables are going up, your ridership is going to be going up.
Okay, so as fare increases, the ridership comes down. Great. What is the meaning of an elasticity with an absolute value between 0 and 1 instead of greater than 1? Or rather, what is the difference between an elasticity that it has an absolute value less than 1 versus one that has an absolute value greater than 1?
relatively inelastic.
Okay, so
So for example, a
in
change in
inelastic versus elastic, those are the terms used to explain the differences, right? So what is an inelastic change?
So a change in price would not necessarily diminish the demands the quantities demanded by people, right? I mean, so
So
you could have
is this fare value of negative 0.3, is that inelastic or elastic?
elastic.
This is inelastic.
I'm sorry, absolute value, yeah,
Yeah,
inelastic, sorry.
this is inelastic. So why? What does that mean in practice?
a change in fare
So I know
at a
that-
certain level would not lead to an equivalent change in ridership. It
Okay.
would lead to less than the equivalent change in ridership.
Okay. Therefore, if you increase fares, you will lose some ridership, but not enough to lose total fare revenue.
Right.
Right? If this value were have an absolute value greater than 1, then you might actually decrease, the response in demand might be so strong that you might end up losing revenue because the demand is so much lower. So if you overprice an item by a lot and nobody buys it, you might end up getting less, right? In transit, the typical values are inelastic. So this is important. This means that any transit agency who needs more fare revenue can probably increase fares and know that they will get more money. That's sort of one of the key conclusions of this. The range of these values is from negative 0.1 to negative 0.5. The elasticity of headway is a little larger in magnitude, so the response of demand to frequency is stronger a little bit than the response to fares. It's often overlooked in ridership studies. And then total travel time, that people respond very strongly to that, right? So, okay, then there are these important other points that I want to go through. Small cities have larger fare elasticities than large cities. Let's talk about each one and suggest reasons for them. So, why would small cities have larger elasticities?
Absolute value.
Yes, absolute value. So, you're saying that they are more elastic, right?
More
Yeah.
sensitive.
Yeah, more sensitive, right? So small cities, ridership in small cities is more sensitive than ridership in large cities. All right.
There's not as much utility lost by switching to a different modes. There might not be as much traffic if you drive instead. So fare might be more of a reason that people that use it, and also that parking might not be as costly. So that if you raise the fare a little bit, you might get more expensive than parking.
Okay, so you have other sort of characteristics that you find in large
Yeah.
cities that you don't find in small cities, such as parking costs.
That would be a way of.
Yeah. Okay. I'm trying to summarize and also repeat for posterity. Abhishek?
Yeah, also like in urban cities, since these elasticities are being computed for the population as a whole,
Yes.
there are more people dependent in general on the mass transit system.
That is very important. This is one of the key factors affecting this, actually. So you have a much larger dependence on public transportation in large cities, and also, yeah. So,
Is it really the size of the city or is it the density of the city?
It's probably density. These are correlated, so maybe this could have been more carefully chosen. And you could say older cities as well. I would argue older pre-auto industry, pre-highway expansion cities is another way of putting this. Yes. More ideas about this? Henry?
I don't know how you're defining
They got
small
it
cities.
first.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Someone first?
Henry.
Henry.
Okay. Okay, you decide.
I was just curious about like how do you define small cities, right? Because for example, I'm thinking in my own country, a small city would be a city of around 300,000 people. And over there, for example, an increase in the fare would have this characteristic because you can still walk the city.
Yes.
So walking is still an option.
Yeah.
And I think it's kind of like correlated with what you were saying about more
Yes.
dependency on transit, right?
Yeah. So all of these things have to do with where you apply them, and maybe they're not completely generalizable, but I think that this observation has more to do with the North American and European context.
Right.
But that's a good observation. Henry?
I think smaller cities also have less extensive coverage.
Yes,
So
very
people
important.
are already trained to not rely on.
So
or
the public
have
transportation
alternatives.
supply might be quite
So-
undesirable
Yeah.
or inefficient, and
Yeah.
so therefore,
And if you jack up the price, then it will make it less desirable.
exactly. Okay, great. Okay, and let's move to the next one. Bus travel is more elastic than commuter rail and rapid rail travel.
Simply, bus travel is more smaller travel distance, and there are possible another alternatives.
Yes, that's the key reason. So if you have a shorter distance, and bus travel tends to be shorter distance, then you are more likely to have other options. Whereas commuter rail, you might be able to drive, maybe you don't own a car, so etc. So there are fewer options in general to the public for longer distance travel, and commuter rail and rapid rail travel tends to be longer distance.
Commuter rail, rapid rail, certainly in rush hour have a time advantage, tend to have a time advantage over the private vehicle. in
That's
rush-
true as
rush
well.
hour.
So
Yeah.
this is
So
another
and the bus,
reason is
the bus never has it.
competitiveness of the mode in rush hour, where buses might be stuck in traffic and rail is not stuck in traffic, right? So and that drives the elasticity more because so many more people are traveling in the rush hours. Great. Let's move on to the third one. Off-peak fare elasticities are double the size of peak fare elasticities. Lee?
Probably the difference between like leisure and business travelers, where you can change your trip decision if it's a leisure trip, but not if you're commuting to work.
Trip purpose, right? So peak travel tends to have a higher proportion of business, and you don't have the option of not doing the trip, so you must do the trip. What else? Something related to that. Yes.
Again, congestion has a role. If to consider like the idea of commuting by Uber
Yes.
in New York City, it might not make sense to do that during a peak period if you're going to be sitting in traffic on the road. And subway has then a time advantage, but
Yes.
returning home late in the evening, that time advantage of transit could be eroded because there's less congestion.
Right. So congestion can have a major effect, and congestion is larger at peak, and therefore it could make modes that are segregated, that have their own right of way, more competitive.
Yeah.
So related to the previous one. What else? Eli.
It's maybe arguments that make you less discretionary ridership during.
Very important. Yeah. So can you elaborate?
Yeah, when during the off-peak hours, you have more people who have no other choice to get around but use transit.
And why not? Why might these people not have other choices?
Because they are lower income.
Lower income, right? So lower income people who work may have no other options. This may be the only option they can afford, and therefore they are less sensitive. So if you raise fares, well, it doesn't look good for them, but that's the only alternative for them, so they don't react. Great. Short distance trips are more elastic than long distance trips. We already covered that in the context of rail, so let's skip that. Fare elasticities rise with income. This should be straightforward.
Or more options if you have more income.
If you have more income, you have more options. You can afford all other options. So there you go. What about fare elasticities fall with age? So older people, senior people, are less sensitive to changes in fare. Why is that? Emily?
Higher income?
They tend to have fewer options
Why?
because, well, like walking might not be an option.
So the active modes might be less
they
desirable,
might,
and
they might not have a driver's license anymore.
they may not be.
or they,
have a
or
driver's
they,
license anymore,
they
yeah.
might, failing vision and therefore not be able to drive or have
Yep.
other.
That's exactly right. Okay. Of all trip purposes, the work trip is the most inelastic. We've covered that. And then promotional fare elasticities are slightly larger than short-term fare elasticities following permanent fare revisions.
Can you
So,
explain that? Well, what is promotion?
so if you do a free fare day, and you put ads everywhere, or something like this, the response that you'll get is going to be much stronger than if you, on a routine basis, raise fares, and yeah. So what does that happen?
Mean the increase in demand due to the lower
Decrease
short-term.
usually. Decrease increase if you reduce them, or decrease if you increase them, right? If you increase fares, decrease them.
But a promotional would be a lower fare, right?
Yes, but we can extend this to how frequently this change happens and how much buzz is there about this fare change. Yes.
People feel like, oh, this is happening once, I gotta do it now. Or I won't be
Yeah.
able to.
So the psychological effect of marketing, right? The effectiveness of marketing on. So if you look at agencies that every year at a certain date raise their fares, more or less with inflation, there's much less sort of the public reaction is much lower. So
Are those promotional fare, like free fare day, free fare weekend, are they effective? Does anyone recommend?
well, I mean, it depends
attracting-
what your goal is, right? So
Well, the goal is
it's not effective
to
collecting fare revenue
attract-
for sure, but it might be effective at increasing ridership temporarily. If you have some event on the city and if you want people to use those modes instead of drive, that might be a success. So you want to increase the efficiency of vehicles by decreasing dwell times, so people don't have to interact with the fare box. You can open all doors, people go in and out. That might be a success. So
Paris once did that for exposure. They
Yeah.
like to try to lure people in and say, oh,
Right.
yeah. But the question is it effective?
Well, again, it depends on what your measures of success are. Emily.
Also, promotional fares might be, might attract more like discretionary trips than
Yes.
than
People might say, "Oh, I want to try this," right?
Yeah. Whereas, like, permanent fare revisions tend to affect people who are just doing their commute, who
And therefore,
are therefore less.
right. So if you do any kind of promotion, you might make people that tend not to even be aware of transit fares be aware of this option, and so you might lure them in. Yeah, Henry.
There are also a lot of cities that do free transit on New Year's Eve to reduce drunk driving.
Yes. So that's another example. So on New Year's Eve to reduce drunk driving, offer free fares. Yes.
So it's safe to say that promotional fares are useful for short-term effects, but they don't have any effect on long-term behavior.
I don't want to make that broad claim, but I think I agree with the premise of it. Okay. Okay, let's revisit a model that we saw on an earlier lecture. This is the TTC elasticity model. Which we saw is used, or has been used, to predict the ridership changes to service changes, right? So ridership response to service changes. So this is let's recap. The total weighted travel time is a sum of 4 components. The in-vehicle travel time, the waiting time, the walking time, which is the access and egress and transferring time, and a penalty for the number of transfers that you have to take for that holy pair. So, and then there are these weights, 1.5. So what does that mean? 1.5 in this equation. I'll generalize this utility equation. It's a systematic utility equation, right? And it has some factors before each of the explanatory variables. Sonia.
People hate waiting, so it is extra.
How much more do they hate waiting?
They hate waiting 1.5 times as much as they hate being in their vehicle.
Yes, exactly. That's a good way of putting it. So now these numbers are nice and round, right? So TTC did not conduct a revealed preference study to estimate them from data, but they align somewhat well with revealed preference studies. So the order of magnitude, at least, is correct. I've seen factors as high as 3 for waiting time, as low as 1 in cases of rush hour in, say, metro. So that gives you a range. Walking, I've seen, 5, 10. I've seen higher. But penalties for number of transfers, I've seen 5 minutes, 10 minutes. So people hate transferring. This is a discrete penalty, so this is 10 minutes for every transfer you have to make. So, great. So what happens? You compute the total weighted travel time before and after. So you have the current situation, and then you have a proposal that will alter these values and result in a new total weighted travel time. And then we apply some elasticities. So these elasticities differ by period. So during the peak, we have negative 1.5. Midday, we have a higher response. This is aligns with what we just said, like peak period ridership tends to be more inelastic, right? So we have a stronger response during the middle of the day, and if you look at early in the morning or evening, even stronger. So we have higher values. Question, why are these values have a magnitude greater than 1? This is a trick question, in some sense.
Travel time is ridership is dependent on travel time is very elastic.
Okay, so that's one way of putting it. So I guess the observation is like these are not fare elasticities, and they are not frequency elasticities. They are elasticities of total weighted travel time, and these are 4 components coming together, and we can't really think about it in terms of fare and elasticity and a single variable already. These are multiple effects coming together. So, great. So do we understand how this applies? We have a service proposal. We estimate the effects on riderships, in-vehicle travel time, waiting time, walking time, and number of transfers. We know how many people would ride before and after, or we don't know that. We want to predict that, but we know for each early pair how each of these components would be affected, and then we use this model with these elasticities to predict the change. Okay? Question?
Yes. Is the 10 in front of n trans, does that mean the average transfer is 10 minutes? Or does this mean people just really, really don't like transfers because they want a simple route?
So this excludes waiting time. This is the fact that I have to transfer is so annoying that I would rather spend, or it would be the same as spending extra 10 minutes in a vehicle. If you give me a situation where I have a single ride option that takes 10 minutes longer, and then you give me another one that takes 10 minutes less, but I have to transfer, I wouldn't know which one to take. They would be equally desirable or undesirable. Yeah.
Would you say that in a more, if this was a more distinct model, then the penalty for transferring rail to rail would be less than the penalty transferring less?
Yeah, of course. You could make this much more sophisticated, and you could say, are there escalators or not? If you could argue are some parts of the city, let's say, less safe, and therefore walking time is very undesirable, especially at night. So you could really sort of go disaggregate and apply all these behavioral impacts. So yeah, you can make this more sophisticated. But you have the idea, right? This is an elasticity-based model. Okay. Direct demand regression models. Again, we covered a little bit of this. We match census tract data to root source characteristics. This is hard without GIS tools. GIS is a geographical information system where you have a map and you can load layers of data showing things geographically, right? Like population density and employment density. Your bus stops, your bus lines, your train lines. So we use GIS tools to apportion population and employment data to different bus routes. So you know that this bus route goes along these centers and have certain properties. Then we run a regression of trying to explain ridership as a function of those characteristics. And often what happens is that you have large or high significance of dummy variables and track-specific constants. So the general variables like frequency, the variables that apply to all bus routes together, tend to be maybe not as significant as statistically as these very specific variables that apply only to one or two bus routes. And that means that in some sense we are specifying a model that is overfitted, and there are some issues with this, right? So the other issue is that these models tend not to recognize network interactions, or they never do, rather, because if you have two bus lines running through the same employment center and going to two different places, both have the same frequency, then presumably they share the demand from that employment center, right? If you only had one bus route and you leave the characteristics the same, then that ridership would be a lot higher. This model doesn't really account for that. That the complementarity or competition of the supply in the network. So that's an issue. And then the relationship between supply and demand is not, the interaction is not captured. So there are alternative approaches. Simultaneous equation models are capable of addressing the relationship between supply and demand. And then some other models are able to capture the relationship between competing and complementary routes. We'll look at an example. That's the logical next step beyond direct demand models. And then full network models, which sort of you have the GIS, you have all the network. Those deal explicitly with competing and complementary routes because people in that model have the option of any bus route and they see all their options. And in these models, you can include trip distribution and model split effects. So that's the next step beyond, the logical next step beyond the TTC type model the elasticity model that we just discussed. Both of these require GIS, some computer representation of the transit network and the service area, this used to be a challenge, not so much anymore. Most agencies put out GTFS data and layers showing where their bus stops are, and so this is now commonplace. This is not an obstacle anymore. Questions about this? Henry?
What is TTC?
Oh, the Toronto Transit Commission. It's the bus agency, right? Yes. Other questions? Okay. So let's look at a simultaneous equation model. So here we have ridership of some route I on some segment Z. So we divide our bus routes into segments, and we have many bus routes and many segments. And we say that is a function of the level of service provided. So think of that as frequency, right? The level of service provided on that bus route, on that zone, and other external factors. Those external factors are demographics, socioeconomic characteristics of ridership, the population density, things like that. So maybe exogenous. Then you say supply, on the other hand, so my level of service is a function of the ridership I have right now, because if I have more riders, I will provide more service, right? Also, it is a reaction to ridership as it was in the past, and it's also a reaction to other external factors. So these two equations are simultaneous. You have to solve them at the same time. And they could take different functional forms. We are specifying it here at a sort of conceptual level. Abhishek, you have a
Yeah,
question?
is that in the second question, is it a typo or do we actually consider the overall ridership in the previous time period?
It could be a function of the ridership in the past, right? Yeah. In other words, this is a way of saying my supply right now, my supply today is a function of what ridership used to be.
No, what I mean is like, should that be segment dependent or do we then scale it up to the entire segment?
Oh,
Should there be a Z there?
it could be segment dependent or not, yeah. Yeah, so you're saying why not add Z? You could. If you want to add it in, go ahead. Again, this is conceptual, so what I'm saying is this is not a specific model, rather this is a conceptual description of how you set up a simultaneous equation model. So the point of that variable is to say that you could include the effect of previously observed ridership. Okay? So don't think about this as a specification of the model. Okay. I'll put this in Stellar. This is a paper that describes this in detail if you want to look at the specifics of such a model. Here's an example from Portland TriMet on that paper. You have Route 19 and Route 20, which run in this diagram kind of east-west. So Route 19 runs along this line right here, and for each bus route we have a catchment area. So Route 19 captures this part on top and also this middle part that is shaded both ways. And then there's Route 20, which runs along this line, and it captures people here and also people in this area. So this area in the middle is people from that area go to Route 19 or Route 20, right? So in that area, Route 19 and 20 are competing, right? Then they just kind of merge and go through zone 0, and they are fully competing. They are, maybe it's a branch and trunk system, right? And then there are these other bus routes, Route 70, Route 75, Route 71, Route 72, that cross south-north, north-south, that corridor. And we say that these bus routes are complementary because people might transfer, right? People going from somewhere on the south might transfer to one of these Route 19 or Route 20. So the fact that Route 70 or 75 is there means that people can, more than not, will be attracted to the corridor. So then we quantify the degree to which bus routes compete with this overlapping population fraction, percentage or proportion. So that's this is the percentage of the fraction of population that is on the overlapping portion. So we look at Route 19 and Route 20, we're saying how much population is on this overlapping area divided by the sum of the population captured by Route 19 and the sum of population captured by Route 20. So that gives you an idea of the degree of overlap. We also measure population in each catchment area for each bus route, and we can then capture inter-route effects. So we do that by modifying the equation 2 slides ago and adding this third equation here. So before we had ridership as a function of level of service and external factors. Now we're adding the ridership on competing bus routes, right? So these are bus routes that are competing on the same segment, and they run with overlapping population. So to the extent that this increases, the ridership on route I decreases. And then we also consider the ridership on complementary routes across this catchment area. And to the extent that this increases, the ridership on route I increases. We also consider the degree of population overlap and the external factors. Again, this is conceptual. If you want to look at the specifics, I suggest you look at the readings. I will post the paper. So this is a way of sort of modeling the effects of complementarity and competition. Okay, a different approach, moving down the list of sort of sophistication of modeling approaches, is the network-based modeling analysis approach. So here we have a transit origin destination matrix as an input. We measure how people are using the system right now. We have a layer, like a GTFS layer, with the base transit network, and we put that into a model. And then we tell that model, we're going to make a change. We're going to add a bus line, or we're going to increase frequency, or we're going to increase fares, whatever it is. And that model will look at the current transit demand and predict changes. Okay, so that's the general idea. It'll also output not just ridership and revenue, but things like rider attributes. And you might have information about income and things in GIS layers that can be allocated to different services. And there are 3 levels of analysis for how to use 3 levels of detail on the OD matrix. The first one is fixed transit flows. So again, in order of sophistication, starting with the least sophisticated, fixed transit flows. So we look at the current transit OD flow. This could be from a telephone survey or from any kind of survey, or we have now modern techniques based on AFC and inference models that we will discuss shortly in the next few lectures. So we have the OD matrix, current OD matrix for transit, and we assume that the demand for transit won't change as a result of the service changes in the short run. So that could be a strong assumption, right? That's typically what we do. That's typically how these models work. Again, we're more interested in the impacts on current riders than on big changes. The next approach is to say the total demand is fixed if I look at the demand across all modes, including car and bike and TNCs and all these things. So that you have to get from surveys, the kinds of surveys that are used to input data into 4-step models. But then you allow the model split to change. So as a result of service changes, people might switch between modes. They might go from transit to car or from car to transit. So that's preferable, especially if you have significant service changes. But it's not often put in place. And then there's the variable total demand and model split. Now you have, you require all the steps of modeling, 4-step modeling, and you are essentially allowing the total demand to increase or decrease as a result of service changes or fare changes. Typically, no one does this, and one could argue this is unnecessary. Why? Because we're looking at short-run changes, and total demand shouldn't change in a very short horizon as a result of at least the typical service changes, right? So yeah, this kind of model is great if you want to capture the influence of land use patterns on long-term demand, for example. If, however, you were to bring in a new rail line that connects two employment centers, right, that's a change in land use. If you somehow think that some change that you will do on your city, on your transit network, will bring in a change in population or a change in where people live significantly, then you have to do this. That's the only case where this would be useful. Otherwise, you probably are thinking in the short run, total demand is the same, people might switch between modes, so you look at step 2. And if it's a very small change, you could even get away with step 1, where you look at current demand and people might change when they make the trip or what bus route or rail line they choose, but not necessarily the level of ridership. Okay, there's all different modeling and analysis packages. Let's show 3 of them. Madituk, ME2, and Transcad. Has anybody heard of any of these? Raise your hand. Okay, about half of you. Great. So let's start with Madituk. It was developed in Montreal, École Polytechnique in Montreal. It requires OD survey data that includes route choice information. So this is a line level model, essentially. It's designed for transit service planning, and it uses all or nothing assignment. So it looks at, for a given OD pair, which is the best path on the network, and then it puts all of the people on the OD pair into that one path. So everybody makes the same decision, kind of thing. And it doesn't have built-in data analysis or graphics capabilities, so you take the outputs of it and you put it somewhere else. These people were using SAS and other software to generate graphics and to generate plots and calculate statistics. It's been used in 4 of the Canadian cities, Montreal, Quebec, Toronto, and Winnipeg. And here's an output from of that data plotted with a different software. So this is, you can sort of see, this is a plot of OD. I'm not sure how it's, if it's like destinations for a given origin or what it is. It might just be, oh, this is number of entries. Yeah, I don't know French, but if anybody knows French.
It's number of entries by foot.
On foot.
On foot.
Yeah. What is that? I don't know that last word.
I don't see it. I don't see it. You know it.
Anyway, and then it says and then it says AM peak from 6 to 9, right?
Yeah.
So okay, great. ME2. So this is a multimodal equilibrium. It was also developed in Montreal. It's a little more sophisticated. It was developed as a general regional transportation modeling package. It can generate transit OD flows from a travel demand model, which the other package needed that as an input, right? It has a link node oriented approach instead of a line level approach. So you can have bus stops and it has more detail geospatially. There are 2 options for transit assignment. There's aggregate zone to zone flow multipath assignment. So that's usually not precise enough because it's zone to zone. And then there's a disaggregate point to point trip assignment procedure, which you could know which bus stops and lines and everything. It is probabilistic or multipath. So now you have an OD pair and different alternatives of how to get from O to D. And one might be preferable, but people might be split on which lines they take, right? And maybe 2/3 of people go one way and a third go the other. And some equilibrium is reached this way. It's a standalone package. This has all the graphics built in. And here's a picture. So, yeah. Transcad, this is much more local. It's over Caliper develops this in Newton. You can get to Newton on the green line. It has good tools to edit transit networks. It has an API that allows you to add your own models. So if you have your own modal split model, you can put it in. It has good interactive computer graphics. database, sort of built-in database. It has a network assignment procedure, lots of display options and output formats, and very sort of general purpose. So typically you use a transit network database for this. So that means geocoded transit links and nodes. You have mappings of transit lines onto network links and nodes. So you have essentially a street network, right? And you say this bus route goes from along these road links, crossing these intersections. And transit lines are modeled with some attributes. So headways by service period, travel times, mode of service, so bus, subway, etc. And there's also system attributes like operating cost data, energy consumption data, and fares. Some of this is, these things are put in, and they then are used to compute outputs, right? So package outputs. So you get ridership by link and by line, boardings by node, by line, by link. You can have OV travel times, so in-vehicle time, and also including the access and egress portions, transfers, etc. Revenue predictions, operating cost predictions, energy consumption predictions, even like CO2 emission predictions. Revenues, operating costs, rider characteristics, and you have all sorts of ways of displaying that: tables, reports, plots, etc. So, how about transit route assignment? How do we go about that? So, transit route assignment is the process by which we assign origin destination flows to specific paths on the transit network, right? So, there are two ways of doing that. There's the all or nothing assignment, which we talked about. That's the example of Malituk. And then there's the multipath assignment, which we gave an example for ME2. When would all or nothing be okay to apply? If you have not too dense of a network and not too many alternatives, right? So in some networks, there's only one sort of feasible, logical path that one would take for a given OLI pair. But if you look at a dense network, say London, there are often for an OLI pair multiple good ways of traveling that OLI pair, and therefore that would not be a good model to use because the flows on each link might be way off. Is that understood? Difference between multipath and all or nothing? Okay. Another way of dividing these or categorizing these is aggregate and disaggregate. So we also looked at these in the context of ME2. So aggregate is zone to zone based on zone centroids. So you have the TAZs, transportation and alpha zones, or census tracts, and you look at demand at that block level. Or you have disaggregate. So if you load a GTFS layer, you have a sort of stop level, line level, much more precise, high resolution output on where the demand would be assigned to. Okay? And how do we go about mode choice? And sometimes how do we go about even assignment to specific lines or options within the transit mode? Often with logic mode choice model. So I think some of you have, anyone who took Tool 1 or is taking Tool 2 has seen this. Raise your hands if you've seen what a logic mode choice model. If you're familiar with discrete choice modeling at all, have heard about it. Okay, sort of. So there were some people that, I see some shy hands that I know are more exposed to it, but, in this kind of model, we specify systematic utility equations, where we say, for each of the alternatives that this person has, there are some variables. These variables include travel time, cost, reliability, fare, anything, right? And the differences between the alternatives are explained in terms of those variables. And then what we get out of, so we run a regression. It's not linear regression, it's a different kind of regression. And what we get out of that is the probability. So we get some parameter estimates, beta, and we can use those to calculate the probability that an individual will take some of the options that we listed rather than the others that were listed. So there's a very good course taught here at MIT, 1202, demand modeling. If you're interested in this topic, I recommend you take it. And it's taught in the spring only. So this allows you to calculate the probability that an individual will choose one mode and not the other. Often this is the structure that is underneath a transcat mode choice model or anything like that. And it's great if you understand how it works. And if you can build your own and put it in there, even better. So, all right. And what are typical variables included in these systematic utility equations for, say, the work trip? Well, in-vehicle travel time, out-of-pocket travel costs, out-of-vehicle travel time, income, gender, auto availability, occupation, right? So, some of these are traveler characteristics, which vary by person survey. So typically you do a survey and you collect information on income, gender, things that vary by person, and then you also collect or put in characteristics of the choices, the options that the person has. And both of these go into the model, both the decision maker characteristics and the options characteristics. And sometimes we defer those two by calling one attribute and the other characteristic. Okay, that's it for ridership prediction, but if you have questions, let's discuss. Yes.
What level of modeling is the T doing for their, and like, do they change their bus network to match
So,
their modeling, or is that
so
sort of a longer term?
the T has a model called Ferret, which is an elasticity-based model with market segmentation. So we talked about, that was mentioned earlier in the lecture. So they they split population by type of fare product. So people with passes that's a proxy for, say, frequent riders, and those people might have different elasticities than people that are less frequent, or people that pay cash, or people, right? So you split people you segment the market, then it looks at previous fare increases, and it calculates the elasticities for each of those market segments, and across several sort of time periods and everything. So then it calculates the total change in ridership and revenue, and also any changes across, like, would somebody now take, let's say, would some people switch to pass or not switch to pass? And, the Transit Lab has done some research on it, and some of the people one of the persons who worked on their research here at MIT now works at CTPS, and is one of the people who sort of apply the model. And then I think for other projects, it depends on the project. So certainly there is kind of the regional long-term planning, which is a more four-step modeling approach. If there's any specific project, I haven't seen what they've done for the Green Line extension. Ari, do you know? You always know something.
Well, I mean, it's the T seems to, lick their finger and stick and see what.
So that's the professional judgment.
That is a completely non-professional judgment. I don't.
Do you know? Does anybody know what they've done for the Green Line extension?
I mean, I'm sure they had to do something.
Yeah, often these capital projects require demand analysis, so I'm sure they did some modeling. I'm not sure to what degree.
They require federal funds.
Yeah, exactly. So some is whether the modeling that the FTA required is the best one is subject to discussion, and I think a lot of transportation experts have issues with it. It tends to put a lot of weight on like if you save many people 1 second, then that's great, and so. Instead of being sort of goal-oriented and
Yeah, I feel like often agencies will do one analysis for their grant and then their own analysis because they think they have a better method.
Yeah, so.
Yeah.
Any other comments or questions on ridership? This is an important topic, right? It's one of the sort of key topics in public transportation. If it's a new system, how many people will ride it, and therefore what mode will I choose? How much will it cost? Many applications. All right.
Well, I guess maybe could you speak to how well models do? Do we have evidence that models are good, models are, what are some examples?
Yeah, I haven't actually seen. I'm not very familiar with any study that has systematically looked at that.
Yeah.
But
Okay, interesting.
again, what we have seen a lot of is the earlier approaches.
Yeah.
And these sort of fudge factors put in, so like the 50% on state of preference without conjoint analysis, things like that. And those are all over the map in terms of whether they were accurate or not. Often they overshoot the prediction, and you wonder to what extent is that a bias because you want funding and you want to show that there will be ridership for it if it's a capital project. But I haven't really seen, and maybe it exists, like a systematic look at recent models and how accurate they were.
And you mostly see it for new systems and extensions, not for sort of existing service changes.
Yeah. Hey, Tom.
I'm sort of interested not in comparing models to what happens in reality, but what we were talking about an hour ago about surveys, how stated preference surveys compared to revealed preference surveys. Like if has anyone done any significant research about
Yes.
a project that was open? What did people say before? About the mode that they were going to use, and what did people then say after about what mode did I use?
Yeah. Again, I can't cite specific results because I don't remember them, but that has been looked at,
Okay.
and there is research and literature on that topic.
Isn't there generally pretty bad follow-up though when
Yes,
these demand models
that
are
is
done? There's like very poor.
Yeah.
But
I think
I
generally
don't actually predict. What
yes,
happened.
that's true. So usually once you do a study, you predict the demand. If the project goes forward, nobody bothers to look at to compare how bad it was off. At least not formally. I'm sure people comment, "Gee, that was way off," or "That was great." But do we have sort of documented studies showing how accurate were these predictions? I haven't really seen many of them.
And
So
then the next question is
like
like,
newspapers.
and the next question, what would we do with that? Like, should we require follow-up, and then if you're
Maybe.
off, then you
That's
gotta
a
pay
good
back
idea,
a portion of the grant you got?
Yeah.
Well, maybe it would allow us to say, okay, which models where have the models worked well, where have they not worked well?
Yeah. But the idea of having this incentive for overshooting is interesting.
The price is right.
If you consistently overshoot, will like penalize you in like future. So that would maybe like put you on a position where you want to be as accurate as possible.
But then you might be too conservative, maybe. Modeling.
Yeah, it could be either way, right? You could be penalized for undershooting as well.
$1.
Penalized to be wrong.
Yeah. So yeah. Any other comments or questions?